Hi, Linda. It's great to talk with you today for lots of reasons. One of those reasons is that I'm teaching business ethics this semester to undergrads at the University of Kansas, and we're using your textbook in our class. So thanks for coming on today.
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm delighted.
Well, Linda, you've had a wonderful career. And as you think back on your research, are there 2 to 3 simple, practical, underappreciated lessons you've learned that you'd most like to pass along to others?
So I don't know if they're underappreciated, but um, they all, I think, revolve around a theme, which is really important for me. And that is the idea of learning continuously. Um, my mother used to joke that, I got a PhD and became a professor so I could stay in school. And I think, she was onto something. So, um, so the first one I am calling choosing your pond carefully. So we talk about, people who are big fish in small ponds. Um, and I guess throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to do that, to move and become a so-called big fish in a small pond. And that is just not me. I think it may fit other people, but it's just not me. And so what I always wanted was to just be one of the fish in a really great pond with other great fish, um, from whom I could learn and who would challenge me and, um, you know, make me think and make me better. And so I think there's actually some research on this that, the environment that you find yourself in, the people who are around you, the kind of work that they're doing has a huge impact on your career. And I really give a lot of credit for the successes I've had to the department that I find myself in. It's just very challenging. You see people around you who are editors and associate editors and publishing in the top journals, and it just makes you want to work harder and um, strive to do that too. And we all know what a pain that can be sometimes to try to achieve in that space. And so you really need motivation, and having people around you who are doing it, I think, is a great way to motivate yourself and keep pushing and keep learning. So that's probably that's my biggest, my number one.
Well, your mom was right on as it relates to me because I did my undergrad in business and worked for a few years and then went to law school. And it was in law
Oh,
school that I realized I want to stay in school the rest of my life. I just want to keep going to school. And so that's why I decided to get the PhD and become a professor. And as a student, you see the teachers teach and you don't realize how much of their job is spent researching, trying to just learn new things. And I really like your lesson of, choosing the pond carefully. And in the ethics class that I teach, we spend a week on having the students try to clarify their values and figure out what they want to do with their lives. And so often many of them will say things like, I want to start a business and make a bunch of money and retire, in 10 years or something like that. I like this framing of, rather than just setting your goal to be the big fish in some pond somewhere. I think it's important to, I think a better framework is, what pond do I want to swim in? Who do I want to surround myself with? There's that saying, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And
yes.
I think there is a lot of truth that I really like this framework of what pond do I want to be in? What pond do I want to be in? Who do I want to surround myself with?
Yeah. Yeah, I really like it too. And I've lived it, right? So I know at least for me, it's worked really well.
And I will say, we've been talking about, conventional level of moral development. And as we know, most people look around to, their peers to determine what is and isn't ethical. So the pond we choose, has massive implications for how we're going to behave throughout our life.
Yeah, I think there's a theory in sociology, differential association theory, which has sort of that same message about you are the people that you interact with. Yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah. So, the second thing is, um, and again, this is very much about me and who I am, but I decided early on that I would think about my research as a stream rather than a program. So the way I think about a program is, what Ed Luck did with goal setting, right? And I have a lot of admiration for that. Somebody who just really, focuses in on something for the entire career. But to me, um, it just wouldn't be the right thing because I want to be open to being diverted a little bit, at least. And a lot of that for me has happened by working with doctoral students, which is one of the things I enjoy the most about my job. And, you know, they obviously need to be interested in things related to the things I'm interested in. But I've never wanted to have a student do my project, right? I want us to get our heads together and say, what is it that, where's the coming together here of the doctoral student and me, and where does that take us? And sometimes it takes us um, in a direction that's um, it's just a little divergent, right? So I had a student early on who was more macro than I was. I think of myself as more OB, um, but he was more macro, but interested in ethics and organizations. And so we did, um, a project that ended up being his dissertation that was more macro, and it was fine. It was great. And I learned a lot. So, I mean, by doing this, you have to be open to learn to new theories, new methods, um, just not always dealing in your comfort zone. And again, that's just a way of expanding and learning. And that's my preference. I rather make myself learn something new. I do quantitative methods, I do qualitative methods. Um, and maybe that means that I'm not the best at any one method, right? Because I don't zero in on that and just get better and better at it. Um, I've always said I've used the method that fits the question I want to answer, and that seems trite sometimes, but it's actually the truth. And I don't know that there are that many people who do that because they don't feel comfortable, in one methodology or another. So for me, it's a stream, and I'm willing to diverge a bit off my path if I find it interesting and intriguing and something I want to know about.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I had Bruce Berry on the show, and one of Bruce's main lessons that he wanted to pass on was this idea of reinventing yourself and being open to it, because he felt like he had reinvented himself a number of times and it was
Yeah.
more interesting. And Maggie Neal had said something similar about she had a doctoral student that wanted to do teams, and Maggie was like, I don't really do teams, but okay, if you want to do teams, I'll help you do teams. And by being open to these new opportunities, and I love your framework of viewing this as an opportunity to learn something new. They say
Right.
variety is the spice of life, and what a great way to be exposed to new ideas as long as we're open to learning new ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say, I'm easily bored. So, so if we do something new, then hey, I'm intrigued. And I did a Teams project a few years back, and because of the pond I swim in, I had somebody in my department who's a Teams expert who, we were able to recruit to join the project. And boy, did we learn a lot, from him. And also felt, on solid ground doing that project because we knew that we were not going to do something stupid, because Stephen was there.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that's another way that you learn is by bringing somebody in, who has a different expertise than you do. And it's also, I think, how some of the best research gets done, right? You bring people together who are experts in different things.
That just reminds me, when I was in law school, I was talking to a friend of mine who was doing, I think he was doing a PhD in business at the time, possibly an MBA. But he said something about how he wanted to start a company, but he just, didn't have like the legal background to be able to do it. And he was, a little bit concerned. And it's like, and I'm thinking like, oh, I would love to start a company, but I don't really have the business experience. And, then you have this moment where it's like, oh yeah, that's why business is formed. One of the main reasons is to, add complementary skills. You don't have to have all of the skills.
No, you just have to be open and not defensive about some, right? You have to pick other people's brains. And I think that's what makes for a good manager too, is to say, okay, I'm going to surround myself with the best people. And then, you know, that's why you're here is because of what you know. And you need to inform me because I don't know all this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Requires some humility to acknowledge it, which is the point. Like,
Yes.
that is the point, to bring in people who can do things that we can't do as well.
Yeah. So, and then the third thing that is also an opportunity for learning is that I have always found a way to stay in touch with practitioners in the field of business ethics. The very, very beginning, um, when the field was really, in terms of ethics officers and, these sorts of people and organizations, it was just starting. And the conference board used to have these meetings in New York once a year in May. And I just would take myself there and sit in on sessions and listen to what they were talking about. And I learned so much about this is what practitioners care about. This is what's keeping them up at night. This is what they are concerned with. And I've continued to do that all the way through. And it has inspired important research that maybe I wouldn't have done otherwise. And my favorite story about that is the ethical leadership research, which started, there were sort of two things that came together. One was that I was at a practitioner conference, and in this particular conference, they would have a gathering at the end where people talked about issues that they were concerned about and that they needed more information about. And at that time, the issue was leadership. They were having all sorts of problems with leadership. And, there was no ethical leadership literature. There was nothing. And I had always said from the time I was a doctoral student, I was not going near leadership. It was too complicated. People already thought they had it figured out. And, that was going to be off limits. Well, I had a doctoral student, Michael Brown, who was very interested in leadership. And so I knew that, and he was interested in leadership and values. And I had him back at the office, and then I had these practitioners telling me, we really need to understand leadership better. So I went back to State College and I said, well, Michael, you know, if this is what you really want to do, I think we could do it. And through the practitioners, I was able to get access to executives to interview, and the rest is history. So sometimes you just get great ideas for very practical research that's going to make a difference. I hope. I think we all hope our research makes a difference. I think there are a few people maybe who don't care about that, but I do. And I've always thought, what's the point otherwise? And so, so yeah, keeping in touch with practitioners is just yet another way to learn.
I think that's really interesting because especially in this field, it's said about us that, sometimes we're just writing papers for other professors in our field and we're not writing for a larger audience. And
Right.
that's interesting that you said this because when I talk about your textbook at the beginning of class, at the beginning of the semester, I tell the students that I really like the textbook because it takes a practical approach. You can imagine there have been a number of ethics seminars taught where people just frankly fall asleep and aren't interested because it can be, very philosophical. And if that's not, your cup of tea, then maybe it's just not that interesting to you. But I'm impressed with your approach. And, I tell that to the students, like, look, you're going to see this in the real world. When you go out and you get a job, all of the stuff we're talking about here is relevant and will apply. And we had a guest speaker from TIA come to class a couple of weeks ago, and she was just talking about all of the different things that she implements at TIA, which are right from your textbook. And I think that was one of the reasons why I was drawn to having you on this podcast today, is because your research is practical and you're focused on doing things that will make a difference for, well, now leaders in organizations.
Yeah, it's interesting that you had someone from TIAA. My co-author, so this is yet another way to learn. My co-author came from the practice world,
Mm-hmm.
and she's now teaching at Temple and has been for years. But we first met when she was working for what was Citibank at the time, way back, and in human resources communications. And there was a little story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about an ethics game that Citibank had created to teach ethics to their employees. And that was really early on. And I saw that, and I picked up the phone in my office and I just called Citibank and I asked for her because it had her name as a person who had, was responsible for it. And we just hit it off and we had this great conversation. And, she said, well, next time you're in New York, let me know. We can go have lunch. And so we did. And then I started inviting her up here to run the game with the MBA students, which really was great. And before you knew it, on one of those trips, we were sitting in my living room and drafting what we thought was going to be an article. And by the time we were done, we said, oh, I think we have an outline for a book. And it was funny because I was I was an academic and she was a practitioner, but we had kind of similar writing styles, very I don't know how to describe it, but um, it wasn't like, it was really hard work to put the two together. And she she's just really great at creating these dilemmas that you find in the book. Those are all hers. And um, I don't know, we have complementary skills. Here we go once again. And um, yeah, I just talked to her not too long ago about, when they're always pushing us to do the next edition, which is an ethical a concern in itself. And I always ask them if they've read the book. I always say, we're going to do it when it's time, content wise. Of course, they want you to do it every couple of years, right? So, anyway, she and I were having that conversation about, when we were going to do the next edition. But it didn't actually, we started out thinking it would be a trade book. And it, there's a kind of long story to this, but there's a guy with a long Penn State pedigree who was an editor at John Wiley, and he happened to be in our building, big Penn State fan, and he came by my office and asked if I was thinking about writing, a book. They were always interested in textbook writers. And I said, well, I have this, idea for a book, but I think it's going to be a trade book. I told him about it, and he goes, no, 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 you got to write it as a textbook. And so I give him credit still in the acknowledgments, because it probably would have died pretty quickly as a trade book, but it has legs as a textbook. And I'm still in touch with him. He actually, retired from Wiley and actually moved up here as his full-time residence. So that's how it became a textbook.
Well, that's really interesting. I interviewed an economist at BYU a month or two ago, and his advice was latch on to good opportunities. And it sounds like, from your perspective, that's exactly what happened. And it was an opportunity for you to learn something new.
Yeah. And I guess, being willing to even do something that isn't that popular or incentivized. So we wrote a textbook. I mean, I wrote a textbook, and nobody writes textbooks at Penn State. It's just not a thing. Just not a thing. You don't get kudos for it. It's not AMJ, JAP. So, but I made the argument, because I think it came out right around the time either I got tenure. Let's see. Yeah, it would be right around that time. I made the argument that it was really unique in the field, and that it was going to allow people to teach business ethics from a management perspective, which was, just not something that the other books were doing. And I actually wrote it so that I could teach the course that I wanted to
Wow.
teach. And, I think it's having, an impact because of that. I don't know how much of an impact it had on the tenure decision, but I think having enough journal articles was more important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say, Linda, several students of mine each semester, this is the second time I'm teaching it, but they, in their feedback, they say this is one of their favorite classes. And I think that has so much to do with the textbook, the structure. Nikki helped me with a mutual friend of ours who's here at KU. Nikki helped me with the structure of the class as well, which I believe she probably got some of that from you as well.
Yeah.
But I think that's a real tribute to your approach of taking a practical approach, where students are saying that a business ethics class is one of their favorite classes. And, I'm not sure how much credit I'll get, if any, for doing this podcast, but for me, it's a chance to learn from people. So trying to kind of implement this lesson, that this kind of overarching theme of trying to learn new things. And I've taken a bunch of your time. I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up.
No, it's been fun. It's been really fun, and I look forward to seeing you in person.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I look forward to sharing these lessons with my children and students. And now I'll have a little more context around the textbook as well when I talk about it each semester. So thanks so much for coming on today.
Sure. Thank you.